All right, welcome, and again, congratulations for getting through one more semester and one more class in your academic career. So hats off to you. Here we go. This is just like the midterm review. I'm going to try not to teach to slides. This is just a refresher. What were the films? What were the important parts? Like the midterm, you'll have 38 questions. These only from the last 8 modules, so not from the first half of the semester. And then this week's questions on the animation, on the film, are embedded in the final. And as always, these questions are taken from the films, textbook, lecture, context videos, and discussion boards. Here's our concepts. You should have them all memorized by now, and it's something that I do think will stay with you for the rest of your movie-going career. There's your narrative, your cinematography, editing, what's a good actor, and then sound. And then for us, we started this in week 9 with the film Little Big Man. American film, a very good director, Arthur Penn. Actors, significant performances by a couple here. This too is satirical. We're seeing a comedic and satirical approach in this film, and you've had now a couple of satires to look at. As we all know, our themes reflect the world that we're in. This is, again, speaking to the Vietnam War. It's from that time. It does have a clear social conscience, and it's one of the first times that we actually get to see a Native American perspective on their culture. You have a protagonist, and you move your protagonist through both camps, which is an interesting approach. Certainly a metaphor for the 60s. It's sophisticated in its shooting, very much Hollywood, and then wonderful performances by Hoffman and Chief Dan George. We then go into a more serious and darker approach on the very same theme. You can tell it dominated those things that were going on in our culture for this particular time. And you're going to see now a very different take on that topic. So Vietnam War. The movie itself becomes what Coppola refers to as a war. It was only budgeted for 5 months, and it takes a year and a quarter. You remember the problems. Remember that there was a leading man they had to replace. The lead actor encounters a heart attack. It does win a few Academy Awards. We see another director as an auteur. The production does go over budget, and he's the one that steps up and puts up all the things that he owns and that he gleaned from the success of The Godfather just to finish his film. It is filmed out of country in the Philippines. It speaks to the war itself and the personal journey of some of the combatants in that war. There's a scene where they interact with the French. They're left over from the colonization of the French. The U.S. is their military is there. Our military is there from the 50s through about 75. And the war itself sparks this anti-war movement and this unrest in the 60s that kind of defines that time. It's a chronological story, but it's not as apparent as some of our films. It can be looked at more as a painting, and it's asking you as a viewer to go on this journey and then decipher some of these themes for yourself. It's a dark film in its approach to war. There's at least 3 versions of it, and 3 for us are this is the important number, varying cuts, varying lengths of time. There's your year and 3 months, epic, vast, acting, Martin Sheen, lead role, almost dies for his role, probably hasn't visited a jungle since, that'd be my guess. Classic character for Duvall. Fishburne as an actor is introduced. Hopper gets a role. Brando has a key role, even though it's only a few minutes of screen time towards the end. And here's an opportunity to compare his acting skills in this film back to an earlier film that we watched, On the Waterfront. Coppola had limited time with Brando. Some of the problems came because he was constantly unhappy with his ending, and he went to rewriting it up to the point where Brando shows up. His solution is to take the confined time. He only has about 3 weeks to film with Brando, and starts improvising. He films that and then stitches that together for the ending of the film. Coppola is one of the writers. And like I've mentioned in the past, I'm not sure that's always a good thing. Certainly in this case, he thought he'd be able to solve some of his production problems, some of his acting problems by just rewriting the film. And it's something that he does throughout. And I think it leads to such a long production cycle. The ratio, fun fact, 100 to 1. So we're filming 100 minutes of film, and out of that 1 minute will make it into the final cut, one of the 3 final cuts. Murch is one of the first sound designers, and this time in film development and this particular film is very important for that. According to him, he's doing almost 90% of his sound by recreating it back here in the States during post-production, during the editing. And Apocalypse Now, first film to use 5.1 stereo surround sound, and this Murch, the sound designer, is credited with. Then we saw Do the Right Thing, another American film. Later, the next decade, 1989, Spike Lee, writer, producer, director. He too is an auteur, director, and like Coppola now, most of the directors that we get these days have come through some kind of film school program, and these two are certainly in that category. 24 Hours, Hot Brooklyn Day, cultural perspective that didn't have much of a voice before this film, and the importance of being financially able to make films so that you can control the story. I'm asking you to compare this narrative to To Kill a Mockingbird. Granted, very different times, but who controls the message, who gets to make that film, changes radically what the story is. Resolution plays a really important part in this film when we look at story structure. This is a very different world. Apocalypse Now, the week before, epic, huge, wide angles, helicopter shots. Do the Right Thing, confined, compressed. The heat, it's meant to be oppressive. Funding, Spike's brilliant in getting his funding, and then actually returns an investment on it, so he keeps getting funded as a filmmaker. A simple story, a day in the street in New York City, and then he brings all the action through the neighborhood. He does believe, like most of the artists here, most of the filmmakers, that they have some responsibility as filmmakers to raise social issues, or issues of import. They can do that and do it so it sparks conversation, and it doesn't always come with an answer. One of the themes certainly is racism, so we come up with a reminder definition of what we mean by this, and it varies a little bit, and we kind of end, here's a very simple explanation of a very, very complex problem. We use these two terms, marginalized and disenfranchised, and that goes back to our very first film from the 40s with Bicycle Thieves. The same kind of a theme in a different political setting. For our actors, the sociological component to it is driving these characters and their actors. And we're looking at, while we're looking at challenging themes, we're extracting out how the filmmaker is using cinematography, narrative, his directing, the acting, the colors, the sets, to tell this story. That's part of what this course is designed to do. Some of the things that he uses: non-traditional framing of the shot, watch his camera movement, definitely editing. He does embrace and use jump cuts, and he uses it even within the theme, not just the opening. Some actors that we still see today in our films, and again, their characters driven very directly by their sociological background. Great use of sound, and sound, I'd even go so far as to say, becomes a character. It's the sound in the climactic scene that's assaulted, that sparks the riot, and the theme from the very opening use of the hip-hop track in the credits and then throughout the film is a character in the sense that it's saying things that are very important in the film and central to the narrative. When these elements all come together, it creates the world that Spike wanted to share with us. And then because of his title and because of the activity, and especially what happens in the resolution, we get to ask as filmgoers, does Mookie do the right thing? And does, in fact, anybody do the right thing? Resolution, again, very important in this particular story. We go there, from there, and we go to Germany, and we look at editing, music time, how time, story time is manipulated within cinema. This is a non-traditional arc. In fact, it's 3 mini arcs that are sewn together. It's the first time that we spend time with the term linear time versus story time. We looked at what the director was trying to do with this. Does show alternate endings and parallel time frames. We talk about that if you go back in time, if you could, one of the story structures is you can't destroy anything or change anything in the past. It could have huge impacts on the future. Again, we see our story arc. This narrative goes into personal relationship between the two of them, and then fate, and what fate either controls or doesn't control about our life. It's a little bit of philosophy here. Use of animation in the film. And then we really look at editing, how external rhythm and internal rhythm come to play a part for a director, for a filmmaker, and that being the internal rhythm is camera movement and blocking within the frame, and then external rhythm, cuts, edits between those. And the two things can work together or work against each other, and it's understanding the role both those play in a film that contribute to the overall film. Here's just an editing, what they call a moviola. Today we get to edit on computers, thank God. And here's a case where literally you can see a frame of film back there on the back set of platters. And when they wanted to cut out one frame, 24 in 1 second, they physically had to take a razor blade and cut that frame out, splice it back together. Very, very laborious process. 3 different story outcomes, same character, but faced with different things within the scene. She does an amazing job. Music, it drives much of the editing, much of the pace, and it's fun to see, much like back in Do the Right Thing, this role that music is playing a greater role in overall cinema. And then, of course, the use of some animation. From there, we went to Pulp Fiction, American film, 1994. And here we're looking at, besides wonderful cinematography, great acting performances, the reason that we really look at this and analyze it is how Tarantino was able to manipulate time, just like last week's film, and what that affords the medium, cinema, to do in telling their story. Tarantino does strive to find authentic sounding dialogue. He prides himself for writing that. Wonderful cinematography. He's not afraid of violent topics, and it is considered a dark comedy. Non-traditional, as I mentioned, the narrative here. Again, here's our dramatic curve, narrative arc. Here's how the segments would play out chronologically, and then here's how they are reassembled within the movie. The important thing here from a narrative standpoint that I've mentioned before is in this rearrangement of story segments, he actually gets to kill one of his main characters, Vincent, and then he also gets to show him walking off into the sunset because he chooses to close the film with a scene that would have taken place prior to the event of being killed, obviously. So these are strengths that our medium gives us that not a lot of other mediums get. Great cinematography, acting, incredible, editing, aggressive, powerful, but somewhat restrained. It's not trying to recreate the editing world like it is the narrative world. Sound, popular music as well. Violence he's not afraid of. And then we talk a little bit about violence in film. Can you make the separation and it's just within a film, or does it contribute to society's acceptance of a violent world? We left there and we got to see the work of one of our great directors today, a Mexican director, Del Toro, and his fascination with fantasy and how he structures his films. They're always interesting and usually very beautifully shot. This This is a narrative with a lot of symbolisms, a lot of metaphors. So he's embedding this hero's journey and telling that through a storybook character, through the young girl, while placing that in a politically charged fascist world in Spain. We know what the narrative is now. We touch on this academic article. One of the things that's raised here is, can storytelling be a mechanism for social change? The story is another story of rebellion. We define Labyrinth. It too's filmed out of the country. Editing wipes are something that's interesting with this. Great cinematography, wonderful acting, and then the sound does fit into this magical world. From there, we leave the traditional Hollywood-type narrative world. We do experience a documentary, Born into Brothels, American film from 2004, filmed in Calcutta. A difficult theme and story. Often documentaries are, but we're looking not only at that theme and that story, but what's the difference in making a documentary? How does that differ from a narrative? Smaller crew, the process. You still have to write, but you're generally writing an outline instead of script. And then you're filming, and then you have to go into the edit. Now the edit is where you start to define your narrative. There's some facts on Calcutta. Prostitution is one of the few ways that these women and these families can survive. It's easy to watch these things from our couch and wonder why they just don't get up and leave. And that is something that's very, very difficult to do. The cinematography tends to be more simplistic. It's more handheld. It has an energy to it that narrative cinematographers try to recreate when they want to. And all of this is because you don't have the luxury of designing sets and controlling that environment. There aren't actors in that traditional sense that we've looked at it. However, most documentaries have some kind of narrator. In this case, it's the filmmakers. Editing is probably the biggest difference in the process of making a documentary as opposed to a controlled narrative. And that's because when we're asking, when we are interviewing people and asking them questions, we're not sure what they're going to say. So we have to ask lots of questions. We kind of have an idea where it should be going. But it isn't until we get back into the edit bay and we start moving these bytes around that the true narrative, the true story comes out. So editors have a greater hand here, I think, in shaping the narrative than do traditional editors. Just wonderful characters and a very sad story. This is an important question. We look at it all semester. Can art influence change? Can cinema be considered art? And if you're creating a cinema, do you have any responsibility to your time and to your culture to cover what would be considered difficult topics? So we leave that, and then we end with the film that we had this week. We just went through this, so no need to belabor this. The interesting thing here is you do have an auteur in Wes Anderson. Most people, once they come to know Anderson and see his work, within minutes of seeing a particular scene, you can go, That's a Wes Anderson film. This is stop action animation, and we look at some of the differences here in terms of filming. Every single frame now is controlled the way the editors control every single frame when they edit. This is how now an animation is shot or drawn. Simple story. It is from a book Anderson finds from his childhood, and much of it is used in the dialogue in the film. Everything is designed in pre-production. There are no accidents in animation. It's all laid out. It's all very, very methodical. It's a type of filmmaking that requires a phenomenal amount of patience. And here's just some figures on that. 24 frames in 1 second of film, 127 minutes in the film. That amounts to the seconds. 182,000 frames that they are shooting frame by frame by frame. Incredible amount and type of work. Great actors, they must enjoy this. They could show up to work in their pajamas and perform, but they contribute directly to this narrative, even just through their voices. And then it's left to the animators and the directors to get those things that we've looked at in other actors, eyes, hands, twitches, and shoot those with the models, the puppets. Incredible editing too, frame by frame. Last thing I'll leave you with is these are all the places that we've been to in just one semester. Do that intentionally so that we don't that we do understand that cinema can be leveraged by different groups, different cultures, and that it usually ends up in at least a different story, if not a different way to tell it. So there's your review on the last 8 weeks. I wish you a lot of luck on the final, and thank you for coming to class each week.